More than 15 years after a series of reports from the Boston Globe exposed widespread sexual abuse by Catholic priests, the church is again reeling from accusations of abuse and cover-ups in disturbing numbers. Last week, a Pennsylvania grand jury report declared church leaders covered up for more than 300 predator priests who abused at least 1,000 kids over a 70-plus year period. Worse yet, the report says there are likely many more victims they don't know about. And for almost all, the statute of limitations has passed. Heather Taylor says her story is among those mentioned in the report. She was just 7 years old when she says the abuse started.
He would put his hands on me, and he would put his hands underneath my uniform. I was told by numerous priests and nuns that if I was to say anything to anybody, that I would go down the drain.
This morning, in an open letter, Pope Francis admitted the church has not done enough to protect victims, writing, "We did not act in a timely manner, realizing the magnitude and the gravity of the damage done to so many lives. We showed no care for the little ones. We abandoned them." Over the weekend, Boston Cardinal Seán O'Malley, who leads the Pope's Commission for the Protection of Minors, also released a statement, which we'll get deeper into in a moment. But for many, these condemnations fall far short. In fact, thousands of people have now signed a letter on dailytheology.org calling for all American bishops to resign. But would that even come close to solving the church's problems at this point? I'm joined by Phil Saviano, a church abuse survivor and founder of the New England chapter of SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, former Attorney General Martha Coakley, a partner at Foley Hoag, who as DA prosecuted successfully 2 former priests for abuse-related crimes, and Mitchell Garabedian, who's represented thousands of victims of church abuse, including some whose cases prompted this Pennsylvania grand jury investigation. Thank you all for being here. Yeah. Let me start with you, Phil. This obviously is not a news story, but it feels like this moment is new, like this critical mass that's developed in the last few weeks is new. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it is a fair assessment because I think that for the average Catholic, a lot of people thought that once the blow-up happened in 2002 with Boston, which then led to other dioceses across the country, they really felt that the bishops had it under control at that point and that the problem was solved. And for the most part, that was wishful thinking because now we see that, well, we just saw the report of over 1,000 victims, at least in Pennsylvania over the years. We have a recent report of Cardinal McCarrick, who is now seen to have been a child abuser, who's the first cardinal to resign under sex abuse
allegedly
charges.
Preying on not just seminarians, but in some cases younger children.
Yeah, as young as 11 years old. We have the third most powerful cardinal in the Vatican under criminal charges in Australia. So it is a different period. And I think that most Catholics are starting to think that we really don't have this under control. We really need to do something.
Martha Coakley, let me ask you about something Cardinal O'Malley had to say over the weekend. He talked about what the church has not done yet, and I want to quote at some length. The Cardinal said, "While many perpetrators have been held accountable in one way or another for their crimes, we have yet to establish clear and transparent systems of accountability and consequence for church leadership whose failures have allowed these crimes to occur." He's the president of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Isn't that failure his failure?
Yes, and it's far too little too late. And I think that what we saw in Pennsylvania is probably more emblematic of what really happened in other dioceses in this country. As we've seen, it's not just the United States, it's Chile, it's Australia, it's Ireland. And so all of these people, particularly in 2018, to say, oh, we failed, the Pope's letter is far too little, and they can say they're sorry, but it's too late for that. I mean, I just feel so strongly about the ways in which predators were encouraged. They were there was a looking of the other way. There were people who systematically knew this was going on. Mitchell knows it, Phil knows it, I know it. But this picture we have out of Pennsylvania, to me, is probably more emblematic of what actually happened in other dioceses.
Mitchell, I don't want to spend too much time on Cardinal O'Malley, but I got to spend a little more. I just asked Martha to respond to a statement he made. It's also worth pointing out that when Cardinal McCarrick was accused, Cardinal McCarrick, who has been accused of misconduct, Cardinal O'Malley received a letter about concerns about Cardinal McCarrick back in 2015, and O'Malley concluded, if I understand correctly, that it basically wasn't his job to look into him. And I'd like to quote from these, if we have them. Boniface Ramsey, a priest, wrote to Cardinal O'Malley in June 2015, when the former nuncio to the Dominican Republic is going to go to trial for child abuse, the Archbishop of St. Paul has just resigned over the same issue. It seems bizarre to me that Cardinal McCarrick's out and about. Was not what he did at the very least highly questionable? I'm not sure whether Cardinal McCarrick's past actions come under your purview, but if they do, all the better. If not, perhaps you'd forward this letter to the proper agency in the Vatican. And in a statement that Cardinal O'Malley put out a couple months ago when the McCarrick matter hit, he wrote, at the staff level, the letter was reviewed and determined that the matters presented did not fall under the purview of the Commission or the Archdiocese of Boston. He said this was in keeping with the practices of the Commission that he leads. It's not clear if he forwarded that letter to the appropriate authorities, but is this really, I read that exchange and I think this isn't a moment for close adherence to institutional protocol. This is a moment where if you have concerns brought to you, you should act on them even if it's not technically your job or not. Is that fair?
Of course. What we have here is Cardinal O'Malley's statement, Pope Francis's statement. They're just words. Cardinal O'Malley was the cleanup man for the clergy sexual abuse crisis in Fall River, then in the Diocese of Palm Beach, now in Boston. Pope Francis said in his statement today, clergy sexual abuse cases belong in the past. They're in the past. No, they're not. They're here today. As we're speaking right now, priests are sexually abusing children. Nothing has changed. The criminal pedophiles are sexually abusing children, and the criminal supervisors allowing the sexual abuse to happen. Nothing has changed. I have coming into my office now, not only from the Archdiocese of Boston, from around the world, adults who are now in their late 20s, early 30s, telling me they were sexually abused by priests in the 90s. It has not changed. There isn't any substance to Pope Francis's statement today in terms of taking any measures to change this criminality.
Phil Saviano, I'd love to get your take as an abuse victim. How did you initially see Pope Francis when it comes to being a change agent on this issue, and how do you see him now? And before you answer, it's worth reminding people that he has had some embarrassing missteps when it comes to this abuse crisis in Chile. 3 men who said that a Chilean bishop had witnessed and ignored abuse against them. He initially said that it was calumny. He also said he'd never heard about the charges against this bishop.
He dissed the victims, basically.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
So have you given up on him as a change agent?
Well, I have as of this morning. I read this letter. I printed it out first thing this morning. I sat in my office reading it. And at first I was stunned. And then I got to the end and I was really appalled because there's so much that's lacking in here. It's one thing that, he admits that mistakes were made. He refers to the pain of children and the fact that many of them will carry this pain for the rest of their lives. But there's not one concrete action that not one thing that he's proposing. And the other thing is, I'd say at least a third of the letter is devoted to the power of prayer, penance, and fasting. And I've been hearing about prayer from the bishops and the popes since the 1990s. When you may remember Cardinal Law's healing masses.
I actually wasn't living yet in Massachusetts.
Well,
remind me and everyone else.
It was in 1997, not long after I established the first New England chapter of SNAP, that victims were starting to come forward. There had been a couple of priests who had already faced criminal charges, and Cardinal Law thought that what he would do was in 5 parishes where allegations of abuse had occurred, he would hold healing masses over a period of, I think it was maybe a week or 2 weeks. So there was a series, one after another after another. And somehow that was supposed to address the problem, and that was going to start to offer a solution. And my feeling was that we need a lot more than prayers to address this issue.
Let's talk a little bit about what might be needed as opposed to just well-intentioned prayers.
Take a step back for a second.
Sure.
Take a step back. You've got an entity that has allowed the wholesale sexual abuse of tens of thousands of children for centuries. Okay? We only go back 7 years in Philadelphia because people have passed away who were abused earlier. My earliest case in Boston is 1937. If that person comes to you with all his supervisors and says, listen, all the sexual abuse we allowed to happen in the past, the tens of thousands of children who have been sexually abused in the past, we're going to get over that now. We've changed. Would you believe them?
I'd be inclined to be skeptical.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about,
very kind,
as you know, your predecessor as AG, Tom Reilly,
Yes.
took some heat when he did not
Yes.
go after Cardinal law and the Boston Archdiocese, other church establishment components here in Massachusetts. Is there anything stopping your successor, A.G. Healy, from bringing the powers of her office to bear here in Massachusetts to look into what's still going on, what has happened previously that maybe hasn't come to light, unlike your story, and initiating some sort of legal but also cultural reckoning in this state?
So let me answer that a couple ways. First of all, I think Tom Reilly did a brave thing back then to do that Attorney General's investigation, and let me commend General Shapiro and his team for doing the thorough job they did, because unless we not only shine a light but make changes, this isn't going to happen. So the idea that in 2002, with the Globe and the attention on this, that everything was going to be fine moving forward, we know that's not true. So there's nothing stopping a Carnegie in any one of the states that has dioceses to do further investigations if he or she thinks that's appropriate. But to your question, it is clear that unless there is accountability for the people who knew about it, not only who did it, but who knew about it or should have known about it. So those bishops should resign. Two other things that have to happen. This church, this institution has to change. They have to allow priests to marry, and they have to ordain women. And if they're not willing to make those structural changes within the institution, I don't think there's any chance that any of this will change.
Hold the thought about the ordination of married priests and female priests for just a moment. I want to make sure that we're clear on this, the statute of limitations when it comes to these crimes. How far back can abuse by an individual of a priest be prosecuted, and how far back could, say, covering up that abuse be prosecuted under current state law?
Well, it's complicated because the laws got changed at different stages and they got extended. And it also, one of the reasons we were able to go after Father Shanley was because he had left the jurisdiction. So there's tolling, and Mitchell knows it, it's different for civil and criminal. But by and large, there is a large extension of time for people into their adult years because it takes a while to recognize this, to discover they were abused, and to... but it's not endless. There's no statute of
Would you
limitations.
two like to see A.G. Healy push on this, or any other law enforcement officers in a way they haven't yet?
Oh, without a doubt.
Sure.
There's so much
Because,
to uncover.
You know, the Globe pushed on the Archdiocese of Boston. What about Fall River, Worcester, and Springfield? You know, we know that one of the bishops in Springfield had been criminally charged with abusing children. But we don't know much else about what really went on out there, how many other priests were involved, and so on.
I thought we were going to have a ton of time to talk about this. We're unfortunately almost out of time, but we mentioned the ordination of female priests and married priests a moment ago. As you three all know, there is a push among Catholic conservatives to go the opposite direction. Cardinal Raymond Burke said that it's time basically to root out gay priests. He said, "It seems clear in the light of these recent terrible scandals there is indeed a homosexual culture not only among the clergy, but even among the hierarchy, which needs to be purified at the root." Phil Saviano, you get the last word on
Yes,
this.
their remark about gay priests is infuriating because it's insulting to all the many, many hundreds of female victims that we had right here in the Boston Archdiocese. That's a dodge. It's not the solution to the problem.
I represent 41 young women who were abused as young girls in the Diocese of Brooklyn by Father Adam Prochaski, who used to bring the little girls from Poland to the diocese, put them in the church, take care of them, and molest them. It's not limited to little boys.
And it's also, there's no greater indication that people who are gay or lesbian are greater predators than people who are heterosexual. So that's just a falsity. That's just unfair.
All right, Martha Coakley, Mitchell Garabedian, Phil Saviano, thank you for being here to talk about this unpleasant topic.